Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, a really complex and high-stakes global event, something that's been all over the headlines. We're going to give you a shortcut to getting deeply informed. We're dissecting a pretty dramatic development using an article from The Economist. The title is quite something. Trump smashes Iran and gambles the regime will now capitulate. So our mission here is to unpack the core ideas, the arguments behind them, and the really significant potential implications. We want you to get a quick but still thorough understanding of what actually happened, why it matters so much, and maybe most importantly, what could happen next.
Wow, yeah, that title smashes Iran and gambles the regime will capitulate. It really pulls you in, doesn't it? It sounds almost like a movie plot, but this is real. I'm definitely ready to dive in.
It certainly is real. And the situation is just layered with tension. The article calls this perhaps the most anticipated airstrike in history. It finally happened in the pre-dawn darkness, June 22nd. Not exactly a quiet affair. The Middle East especially was, holding its breath.
So it was like everyone knew it might happen, just watching and waiting.
Exactly, a kind of countdown. And the details of the execution, as The Economist lays them out, are frankly pretty striking. We're talking 6 American B-2 bombers. And they weren't dropping just, regular bombs. They used these things called bunker-busting bombs.
Ah, bunker busters. I've heard that term.
Yeah. Think of them like a super strong drill combined with a powerful explosive. They're specifically designed to penetrate really deep, hardened targets, which is key because Fordo, one of Iran's main nuclear sites, was the main target here.
Okay, so bunker busting means they're special for deep targets, not just surface stuff. Makes sense if Fordo is buried, like really deep. What did the article say about where it is?
Absolutely. Fordo was famously buried under the side of a mountain. We're talking maybe 500 meters of rock cover. It's deep. And to give you a sense of the power involved, they apparently used the GBU-57. This thing is a 13-ton bomb. It's actually the largest non-nuclear bomb in the U.S. arsenal.
13 tons! Wow!
Huge. And get this, because there was apparently some doubt that even one could penetrate deep enough reliably, reports suggest they dropped between 6 and, well, maybe even 12 of them on Fordo.
12?
Yeah.
That's incredible firepower aimed at one place.
It really is. A major show of force.
Right.
And beyond Fordo, the U.S. also hit 2 other key nuclear sites, Natanz and Isfahan. Those were struck with cruise missiles launched from submarines.
Okay, so different approach for those ones.
Right. And an interesting detail the article notes, both the UN's nuclear watchdog and Saudi authorities reported afterwards that there were no signs of nuclear contamination.
Yeah.
Which suggests the strikes were, quite precise, aimed at neutralizing the facilities, not causing widespread fallout. And just to give a bit more context on why the region was so on edge, Mr. Trump had been threatening this kind of attack for months. Plus, Israel, which had actually been at war with Iran since June 13th, just days before, had been really pushing him to do it. So this wasn't out of the blue. It was the culmination of a lot of pressure.
Right. That paints a picture of intense anticipation. The stakes must have felt enormous.
They absolutely were. Okay, so let's move to assessing the damage. Right after the strike, President Trump gave this address from the White House, saying Iran's nuclear program was completely and totally obliterated. Very strong words, very definitive.
Yeah, obliterated. Sounds like mission accomplished. But I guess The Economist might see it a bit differently.
You guessed right. And this is where the analysis gets really crucial. The Economist argues that obliterated is probably an overstatement.
Why that?
Because Iran had, and this is the key quote, decades of accumulated expertise that is hard to eliminate just with bombs.
Yeah.
You can destroy buildings, but not necessarily the knowledge. However, the article does say that if Fordo was truly destroyed, it has likely set the program back significantly.
Okay, set back significantly. What does that actually mean in practice for their ability to make a bomb? Are we talking about stopping them from getting weapons-grade uranium? Is that the main thing?
That's the absolute core of it, yes. When we talk about enriching uranium to near weapons grade, that's the whole process. It's about purifying uranium to a very, very high concentration, enough to potentially be used in a weapon.
Like refining metal.
Kind of, like getting raw ore to pure gold, but for nuclear material. Reaching that critical purity is the goal for a weapon. Now, about the damaged Fordow was one of only 2 sites Iran had doing this high-level enrichment. The other one, Natanz, had apparently already been hit pretty hard by Israeli strikes before this. So the thinking in the article is if both Fordow and Natanz are now wrecked, Iran may be left with no large-scale enrichment capacity, at least for now. And even if the bombs didn't physically vaporize the underground halls, the sheer shockwaves from those huge explosions could have easily wrecked the sensitive equipment inside. The centrifuges, they're delicate.
Okay, so direct hits or indirect damage, the effect could be substantial on the equipment.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a stockpile earlier. What about the actual enriched material they might already have? Did the strikes get that?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where things get murky. The article says the status of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium is unclear. A lot of it was reportedly stored in tunnels at Isfahan. The cruise missile attack there was likely aimed at collapsing those tunnel entrances, trapping or maybe destroying the material inside.
Sealing it off.
Right. But here's the catch. Even before the strike, Iranian officials had kind of hinted they'd move some of that uranium somewhere else. So there's this big question mark over whether the strike actually neutralized all or even most of the existing stockpile. Big uncertainty there. And that uncertainty leads us right to the next critical question. How does Iran respond? The immediate reaction, the article says, was fast. Just hours later, Iran fired a barrage of ballistic missiles towards Israel, sent people running for shelters. Most were intercepted, thankfully, but the message was clear. Retaliation.
Okay, so an immediate direct hit back. But what about longer term? They warned about consequences, right?
Yep.
When they say things like all options, what does the article suggest that could actually mean? Sounds pretty ominous.
It is very serious. The article lays out what it calls Iran's menu of options, and none of them sound good for regional stability. For example, they could fire drones or missiles at U.S. bases in the Middle East.
Okay. Direct hit on U.S. assets.
Or they could go after America's allies. Think oil fields in Saudi Arabia, maybe even skyscrapers in Dubai. Big symbolic targets.
Yeah.
Another option is trying to blockade the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz, that sounds familiar. Why is that so important?
It's massively important strategically. It's this narrow channel, a waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. And the key thing is about one-third of all the world's seaborne crude oil goes through it.
A third? Wow.
Yeah. So if you block it, it's like blocking a major freeway exit for global oil supply. Huge economic consequences, a real choke point. And then beyond direct military action, there's the option of using proxies.
Proxies. What does that mean exactly? Like other countries acting for them?
Good question. Not necessarily countries. Proxies here means groups, militias, maybe individuals that act on behalf of Iran, often with their funding, weapons, or direction.
Okay, so Iran doesn't get its hands dirty directly.
Kind of, yeah. Like sending someone else to do the job. The article mentions specific groups. The Houthis in Yemen, they've already threatened more attacks on ships. There are militias in Iraq that have launched drones at Israel. And then there's Hezbollah in Lebanon, a very powerful group that Israel is definitely watching closely.
So lots of ways they could hit back, directly or indirectly.
Exactly. But here's the massive risk for Iran. The article says any of these moves risk being suicidal because they could easily prompt an even bigger American response. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, he's in a really tough spot. He needs to look strong. He needs to retaliate somehow, but he also desperately wants his regime to survive. It's a huge dilemma.
So they have plenty of options, but all of them could lead to something much worse for them, a really difficult balancing act.
Couldn't put it better myself. Which brings us neatly to Mr. Trump's strategy here. The article calls it his favored tactic. Escalate to de-escalate.
Escalate to de-escalate. That sounds backwards. How does that work?
It does sound counterintuitive, yeah. It's a deliberate strategy. You intentionally ramp up the pressure, the aggression, maybe make big threats, but the ultimate goal is actually to force the other side to back down, to reduce the conflict overall.
Like bluffing in poker, maybe? Going all in to make the other person fold?
A bit like that, yeah. Or like a negotiator, starting with crazy high demands, hoping you'll settle somewhere lower, but still good for them. In this case, the end is to make Iran capitulate.
There's that word again, capitulate,
Yeah.
from the title. So that's the gamble, that this massive strike will just make Iran give up.
Exactly. To capitulate, yeah, it's a verb, means to surrender, to give in, especially when you're under pressure, to stop resisting. And Trump himself was pretty blunt about it in his speech. He said, the bully of the Middle East must now make peace. And he warned that if Iran doesn't comply, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier. Now, interestingly, the article notes some Iranian officials have already tried to sort of downplay the damage from the strike.
Oh, why would they do that?
Well, the thinking is it might be a subtle sign that they also want to avoid a really big response, a big riposte, as the article puts it, a sharp counterattack that could escalate things further. But it also cautions that there will definitely be others in Iran pushing hard for exactly that kind of aggressive retaliation. So it could still easily spiral. And this strike definitely caused ripples back in the U.S. too. Predictably, maybe. You had what the article calls isolationist voices, people like Steve Bannon, who used to be Trump's strategist. They were warning against getting directly involved, saying America was just kicking over a hornet's nest.
Yeah, worried about getting dragged into a bigger war.
Right. On the other hand, most Republicans were, well, either supportive or quiet about it. Congressional leaders mostly rallied around the president, though cautiously, like Senator Wicker, head of the Armed Services Committee, just saying America faced very serious choices ahead, very measured. Democrats, though, largely condemned the president for ordering the attack without getting approval from Congress first. That's a common point of friction, the balance of power between the president and Congress on using military force.
So, sounds like a lot of division in the U.S., too. No clear consensus on whether it was the right call or what comes next.
Definitely divided, which leads us to the really uncertain future. The Economist lays out a few scenarios. There's the best-case scenario, at least from their perspective.
Okay, what does the optimistic view look like?
In this view, Iran chooses a mostly symbolic retaliation, something like they did back in 2020 after Qasem Soleimani was assassinated enough to save face, but not enough to trigger a massive escalation. Then, hopefully, Trump would push Israel to de-escalate its own conflict with Iran and maybe urge Iran back to the negotiating table for a new nuclear deal. The U.S. goal being Iran giving up enrichment altogether.
It seems optimistic, maybe?
Perhaps. The article also gives another scenario, maybe more likely. The war doesn't immediately blow up into a huge regional conflict, but it also doesn't end with a deal. Instead, Iran might double down on its nuclear project.
Double down. Okay, what does that involve? Getting more aggressive about it? More secretive?
Both, potentially. Doubling down here could mean Iran actually abandoning the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
The NPT. I know it's important, but refresh me quickly.
Sure. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is this major international agreement signed by most countries. It's meant to stop the spread of nuclear weapons while still promoting peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Basically, a global pact to limit the nuclear club and keep things safe.
Got it. So if Iran leaves that,
big deal. They could kick out the UN inspectors who monitor their program. They could try to rebuild everything in secret. The article even mentions that Iranian officials were talking just recently about maybe setting up a third uranium enrichment site. If they go that route, it's a huge escalation in itself.
And if they go secret, what about that phrase the article uses, a dash for a crude nuclear device? That sounds really alarming.
It is alarming. A dash for a crude nuclear device, it's an idiom. It means making a really fast, urgent push to build a basic, maybe not very sophisticated nuclear bomb.
Like speed over quality because they feel threatened.
Exactly. If they think they're under immediate threat, they might just try to build something as quickly as possible, even if it's not perfect. The implication is they might have a hidden stockpile of material and the centrifuges ready to go, and they just make a break for it. So, yeah. To wrap things up, the article really emphasizes that while Trump's strike likely set back Iran's program, the overall consequences are just momentous and unpredictable. It's a real turning point. The final possibilities it sketches out are stark. Iran could escalate, forcing Trump to hit back even harder. The regime itself could totter, become unstable, maybe even collapse, which would cause chaos across the region. Or maybe, just maybe, the attacks could somehow galvanize talks, leading to a deal that ends the nuclear threat and Iran's isolation. That's the hopeful path. But there's also the grim possibility that the regime survives, becomes even more of a pariah state, and gets even more determined to build a secret nuclear weapon. And that could drag the U.S. into a really long, costly military campaign just to contain the threat.
So we've covered the strike, the damage assessment, Iran's potential responses, the U.S. strategy, the political reactions, in these really uncertain future scenarios. Thinking about all this, all the unknowns and the massive stakes, what strikes you as the single hardest part of making these kinds of foreign policy calls? When you just can't be sure how the other side will react, what part of this deep dive stays with you the most?
It really highlights just how many interconnected parts there are, like dominoes, but you don't know which way they'll fall. And the unpredictability, after such a huge action, trying to guess the next move and the move after that, it feels almost impossible. The sheer weight of those decisions, that's what sticks with me. A really deep dive indeed. Thanks.